On the 8th of May 1945, while crowds celebrated in London, Paris and New York, Europe was not a liberated continent. It was a continent broken into pieces. Approximately 70 million people inhabited the ruins of the Third Reich, and of them, between 8 and 8.5 million had belonged to the National Socialist Party. Added to the members of the German Labour Front, the National People's Welfare Organization, the Hitler Youth, the Women's Leagues and dozens of affiliated organizations, the most conservative estimates speak of up to 45 million Germans involved in some way in the apparatus of the regime. The question that the Allies had on the table was brutal in its simplicity. What do you do with those people? There was no historical precedent. No one had ever tried to dismantle a state ideology that had penetrated every last pore of a modern society. The school, the hospital, the courthouse, the barracks, the factory, everything had functioned for 12 years under the rules of Nazism. The jurists who would judge the criminals had been trained under those same rules. The doctors who would attend to the survivors had worked in that system. The police who would maintain order were the same ones who had maintained it before. What followed was not just justice, it was also ambition, pragmatism, hypocrisy and oblivion. And in the midst of all that, millions of ordinary people tried to survive in the ruins of a world they themselves had built, or consented to, or simply had not known how to stop. The first difficulty was mathematical, and it was insuperable. In September 1945, when Allied officials began to distribute the Fragebogen, the denazification questionnaire composed of 131 questions, they faced a problem that no war plan had foreseen with sufficient seriousness. German citizens had to answer about their membership in the party, their ranks, their functions, their participation in paramilitary organizations, their relationship with concentration camps, their income under the regime. The form was an imposing instrument on paper. The problem was that it had to be processed for several million people. In the American zone alone, General Lucius B. Clay faced an avalanche of 13 million completed questionnaires. His staff was insufficient. Translators were scarce. The special courts, known as Spruchkammern, relied heavily on Germans who had not been Nazis, and in the Germany of 1945, finding a sufficient number of those people to form functional tribunals in every city and town was a task bordering on the impossible. Clay and his advisors understood something that the architects of the plan had overlooked. If applied with mathematical rigor, denazification would paralyze the economy, empty the hospitals, close the courts, stop the trains, and make reconstruction impossible. The result would be absolute chaos in the heart of Europe, just at the moment when tension with the Soviet Union was beginning to become the new strategic priority. The writer Ernst von Salomon, detained by the Americans without having been a party member, described the arbitrariness of the system with a precision that decades of subsequent historiography has not managed to surpass. He was imprisoned in different camps for months. His partner of Jewish origin was arrested with him. No formal charges awaited them on the other side. Only suspicion, the form, and the routine of a system overwhelmed by its own ambitions. The writer noted in his memoirs something that summarized the confusion of the moment. When he arrived at the camps, he found citizens completely alien to the regime alongside second-tier party officials. No one seemed to know exactly who had been detained and why. The internment camp in the American Bavaria that Salomon describes contained everyone from a historian of the Bayreuth Orchestra, from whom soldiers seized his violin on the way, to a man from the town of Kufstein who had been arrested because in a cafe conversation he maintained that Poland had provoked the war. The sociologist Alexander Mitscherlich, who examined hundreds of former prisoners of war in the following years, documented something disturbing. Former soldiers and officials tended to compare themselves with the victims of Nazism. They felt themselves persecuted. It was a psychological inversion that the Allies had not anticipated, and which revealed how deep the regime had penetrated into the German consciousness. But beyond individual psychology, the structural problem was immense. German society in 1945 did not have on its reserve shelves a generation of judges, doctors, engineers, teachers, and officials without any contact with the Nazi apparatus. In Nordrhein-Westfalen, the new state created by the British by merging two regions under their control, the proportion of judicial personnel retained despite their record under the Reich reached 96%. It was not corruption, it was pragmatism in the face of the void. On the morning of the 20th of November 1945, in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, the courtroom of the International Military Tribunal filled with uniforms. In the dock, the men who had built the Third Reich. Hermann Göring, with nearly 30 kilos less than in his years of splendor. Rudolf Hess, reading novels by the Bavarian writer Ludwig Ganghofer as if the courtroom were a reading room. Ribbentrop with a vacant stare, Keitel rigid as a statue, Streicher shouting insults, Speer the armaments minister who had bet everything on appearing contrite. The American prosecutor, Justice Robert H. Jackson, had calculated in his opening speech that 5.7 million Jews had lost their lives as a result of Nazi orders. Most of the defendants claimed to have known nothing. Göring was the exception. He refused to kneel. When Colonel Andrus, the American jailer, organized the formal humiliation of ordering him to strip of his medals, Göring took it with a calm that unnerved his captors. On the stand, he became the master of the room. The journalist John Dos Passos, who covered the trial for several American publications, described him as a deflated balloon, but still capable of dominating any space. When the British prosecutor, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, pointed out his responsibility in the execution of 50 British airmen after the Great Escape, Göring began to sweat for the first time. While the debates went on in the courtroom, in the cells of the Palace of Justice, the American military psychologists, Kelly and Gilbert, took note of the reactions of the defendants during the screenings of the films about the camps. Funk broke into tears at the images of the crematorium ovens. Hess watched them fascinated. Frank collapsed. Göring tried to maintain composure, said the film was incredible, but the images affected him. Later, when the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, gave testimony about the gas chambers with the same coldness with which an official describes an administrative procedure, Göring leaned toward Admiral Raeder and whispered, "If it weren't for this damn story of Auschwitz, we could mount a proper defense." The sentence arrived on the 1st of October 1946. 12 death sentences. Göring was the first on the list. On the night of the 15th of October, while the gallows was being set up in the tribunal's gymnasium, the inmates could hear the hammer blows. Fritz Sorkel, the superintendent of slave labor, began to scream. In the absence of Göring, who had committed suicide with a cyanide capsule hours before, Ribbentrop was the first to climb the scaffold. The executioner did it poorly. The rope strangled him for almost 21 minutes before he died. The bodies were photographed, moved to a house on Heimannstrasse in the Zolln neighborhood in Munich, examined by Allied teams and cremated. The ashes were thrown into the Konventsbach stream 75 meters from the house. In the registry book, Hermann Göring appeared under the name Georg Munger. Julius Streicher, the man who had dedicated his life to inciting Jewish extermination, received the name Abraham Goldberg. But the 12 executed were not the nation, they were the top. And below the top there was an immense pyramid of middle-ranking officials, judges, doctors, police, guards, industrialists, administrators, teachers, and neighbors who had made the system work. Before the great leaders arrived in the dock, the Allies needed to capture them. The process was, in many cases, as revealing as the trials themselves. Himmler, the main architect of the camp system and the Holocaust, never reached the court. After being rejected by Dönitz in Flensburg, he disguised himself as a field police sergeant under the name Heinrich Hitzinger, a man whom he himself had ordered executed for defeatism. He shaved his moustache and put a patch over one eye. The British detained him at a roadblock halfway between Hamburg and Bremen on the 21st of May. They did not recognize him. Himmler had to reveal his own identity because he still believed he had something to offer the Western Allies and wanted to talk to Montgomery or Churchill. In the headquarters of the Second Army in Barfeld, Dr. C.J.L. Wells examined him and detected the vial in his mouth. Himmler was faster and broke it with his tongue. He died shortly after 11 at night on the 23rd of May. They buried him in an unmarked grave on the Lüneburg Heath. Göring, in contrast, believed until almost the end that he could negotiate. On the 7th of May, the American forces of Brigadier General Robert Stack were converging on the areas where he was supposed to be, around Mautendorf in Austria. They found him stuck in the traffic of the retreat in a car loaded with his leather suitcases with his initials. 2 days later, he was posing for photographers in Kitzbühel. According to some testimonies, he was seen on the balcony of the Grand Hotel with a glass of champagne in his hand, conversing with American officers. The Americans gave him relatively polite treatment at first, with informal meetings where they encouraged him to speak about the other Nazi leaders. They discovered that Göring had a remarkable psychological analytical capacity regarding his former comrades. He described Hitler as someone with a narrow mentality and Ribbentrop as a scoundrel. Dönitz irritated him. Speer as well. When they took him down to the cells of Nuremberg and assigned him a defense lawyer from a list containing 206 German jurists, of whom 136 had been party members and 10 from the SS, Göring chose the patent lawyer Otto Stahmer and began to prepare for the greatest role of his life. The architect Albert Speer took the opposite decision. His legal advisor, the diminutive Berliner Hans Flachsner, gave him precise instructions. Do not overact his role. The Allies had already decided he was a minor criminal. He should not give them reasons to reconsider. Speer showed himself contrite, admitted his general knowledge of the slave labor regime, and presented himself as the technocrat who had been too busy to look at what was happening around him. The strategy worked. He received 20 years in Spandau prison while others received the gallows. The inventor of the concept of crimes against humanity as an international legal category was the Polish Jewish jurist Hirsch Lauterpacht, who worked with the British prosecution team. The inclusion of this category in the Nuremberg Charter was a radical innovation. For the first time in history, a state could be judged not only for what it did to other states, but for what it did to its own citizens. It was the legal basis on which the International Criminal Court would be built decades later. After the Great Nuremberg Trial came what historians call the secondary trials, 12 additional processes conducted exclusively by the Americans, in which 185 people appeared before as many tribunals. Doctors who had experimented on human beings, the high command of the Einsatzgruppen, the death squads that had murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews in the East, the directors of IG Farben, the members of the judiciary of the Third Reich, the diplomats of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Otto Ohlendorf, commander of Einsatzgruppe D, had testified in the first Nuremberg trial with a clinical coldness that left those present speechless. He described the methods of mass murder, the logistics of gathering victims under the pretext of a relocation, the transport to pits dug 10 kilometers from the town, the shootings. He said that families were murdered together to spare them the distress of knowing what had happened to the other. He presented himself as a man who had obeyed orders with repugnance. The British lawyer Reginald Paget, who would later defend Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, analyzed the figures with skepticism. Ohlendorf claimed to have cleansed all of Crimea of its Jewish population with a small group of about 500 men. Paget's calculations suggested that the logistics of loading, transport and execution that Ohlendorf described could not have produced the numbers that he himself attributed to his unit. But the objection did not change the nature of the crime. Ohlendorf was hanged in Landsberg am Lech in June 1951. Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, heir to the industrial empire that had used slave labor on an industrial scale, received 12 years in prison and the confiscation of his assets in 1947. He was released in 1951. By the middle of the same decade, he was once again one of the most powerful industrialists in Western Europe. The trial of the Krupp's directors revealed something that uncomfortable the American prosecutors. International law in force at the time of the events did not make an industrialist responsible for what happened to the labor force the state assigned to him. The prosecutors had to rely on an expansive interpretation of war crimes that many jurists questioned. The lawyer and future federal president of Germany, Richard von Weizsäcker, defended his father Ernst von Weizsäcker in the process against the diplomats. Ernst had been state secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during the war. American prosecutors accused him of having facilitated the deportation of French Jews. The defense argued that he had tried to stop it, that his internal memos demonstrated his opposition to the regime. He was convicted anyway to 7 years. One judge dissented and asked for his acquittal. The American High Commissioner John McCloy released him 2 years after the sentence was served. The Nuremberg process established something that went beyond the framework of the trials themselves, the doctrine of individual responsibility before international law. An officer could refuse to carry out a criminal order. Obedience was not an excuse. It was a radical break with centuries of military law, and it was also inevitably a rule that the Allies themselves would apply only to the vanquished. The law for liberation from National Socialism and militarism was promulgated in the American zone on the 5th of March 1946. It established 5 categories for classifying those who had been part of the regime. The first was that of the major offenders, convicted Nazis, war criminals, direct beneficiaries of the regime. The second were the active offenders. The third, the lesser offenders. The fourth, the followers, party members who had not committed specific crimes but had endorsed the system. And the fifth category, finally, was that of the exonerated, people who had formerly remained within the regime but could demonstrate that they had done so without enthusiasm or that they had acted against its interests. The fifth category soon became the category of mass salvation. The mechanism of the Spruchkammern relied largely on character testimonies, the so-called Persilscheine, in reference to the Persil brand of washing powder. A Persilschein was a certificate of political cleanliness. The problem was that everyone needed one, and that the network of mutual testimonies that was woven was almost impossible to verify. The writer Ernst von Salomon, who knew the system from the inside during his months of internment, described it with bitterness. The most serious Nazis obtained the best testimonies, while people without any position rotted in the camps waiting for someone to deign to sign the correct paper. The denazification process also generated a curious phenomenon that the Americans termed the fire escape effect. The most urgent and visible cases were processed first, while the more complex ones piled up in the archives. By the time the Spruchkammern reached the middle-ranking cases' regional officials, factory managers who had supervised slave labor, doctors who had signed fraudulent certificates, the political pressure to close the process was already unbearable. The emergence of the Cold War meant that West Germany needed to be a functional ally, not a society in perpetual trial. The novelist Boll captured this atmosphere in his short stories of the post-war years. A character returns from captivity, looks around and sees that those who had been most clearly harmed by the regime, the opponents, the persecuted, remained in misery, while those who had prospered under the Reich found ways to reintegrate with a certain elegance. It was not necessarily active corruption. It was the natural sediment of a society that urgently needed to believe that the past had ended and that the present was manageable. By 1948, the Americans had processed just over 3 million cases. Only 1,549 people had been classified in the first category. Around 22,000 had remained in the second. The vast majority, more than 2 million people, had been classified as followers, with minor sanctions or directly exonerated. The denazification policy was officially closed on the 8th of May 1948, exactly 3 years after the end of the war. While the Spruchkammern processed forms, the internment camps operated under different rules. The Americans had established what they called concentration zones along the Rhine. In the spring of 1945, with the war still ongoing on some fronts, soldiers and captured civilians were pushed toward open stretches of land on the banks of the Rhine, without tents, without sanitary infrastructure, with insufficient rations. The months of April and May 1945 were exceptionally cold and rainy. Prisoners slept in the mud. Many dug holes with empty cans in search of some shelter. The holes collapsed during the night. The Nuremberg camp, one of the largest, came to hold 90,000 men at its peak capacity. Buderich had 77,000. Summing the 12 camps established between the Rhine and the Nahe, the total number of inmates exceeded 1 million people at some point. Official American figures on deaths in these camps speak of about 6,000 deceased until July 1945. German estimates are 32,000. Investigations following the discovery of mass graves within the perimeter of some of these camps raise the total figure to around 40,000 dead. The writer John Dos Passos, who visited these camps on behalf of several American publications, reached the conclusion that the Germans were being systematically deprived of food. His articles caused deep discomfort in Washington, but did not immediately change policy. The logic of the occupation was in a way the inverse of humanitarian logic. The flow of resources for German prisoners depended on the Allies not needing them for other purposes. In 1945, other purposes abounded. The British camps presented significantly better figures: 1,254 documented deaths among German prisoners on British soil. The number of Germans who worked as prisoners in Great Britain peaked in the third quarter of 1946. Nearly 400,000 men distributed in about 600 camps. Many worked on farms in northern England and Scotland. The treatment they received from the English civilian population surprised the prisoners themselves. Kurt Glaser, one of these men, remembered how an old man in Nottingham approached him during a walk and put a florin in his hand without saying anything. Life in the British camps had its cultural dimension. Charlotte von der Schulenburg, who fled from Mecklenburg and ended up settled in a camp in Holstein, described the activity that arose among the crowd of prisoners. Chamber music ensembles playing among the barns, plays performed in the sheds, poets reading their texts to hundreds of captured soldiers, sometimes under a tree, sometimes standing on the manure mound of the farmyard. It was culture as a form of dignity in the face of total collapse. The most brutal contrast was offered by the French zone. Official statistics speak of 21,886 German dead in French captivity, although the real figure could be higher. In a camp in the Sarthe region, the daily ration was 900 calories, when the minimum to survive was estimated at 2,000. In the camp hospital, an average of 12 prisoners died per day. French journalists who visited the camps compared them in their articles to Buchenwald. The magazine Le Figaro went as far as to write, "These horrors should not become the subject of a sporting competition in which we strive to surpass the Nazis." In the winter of 1945, Heinz Pust was a German soldier captured in Czechoslovakia. On the 9th of May, he had heard shots in the air from Soviet soldiers, and it was the first time he knew that Germany was losing the war. They gave him papers that, in theory, allowed him to go home. Local partisans found him hiding in a forest and handed him over to the Red Army on the 16th of May. During the following years, they transported him to the Caucasus, sent him to a camp in Georgievsk along with Hungarian prisoners, fed him with kasha 3 times a day, 17 grams of sugar, and 5 of tobacco that he turned into cigarettes with newspaper sheets. The first package from home was delayed in arriving until 1950 or 1951. It had a copy of Goethe's Faust, Part 1, which he knew by heart. In December 1949, Pust was formally processed for war crimes. A tribunal judged him in 20 minutes. He received 25 years of forced labor. They moved him to Rostov-on-Don. They shaved his head, took his fingerprints, and photographed him from the front and in profile. The death of Stalin in 1953 opened a gradual process of liberation. The visit of Chancellor Konrad Adenauer to Moscow in 1955 accelerated the return of the last survivors. In 1979, it was believed that 72,000 German prisoners were still alive in the Soviet Union. The situation of German generals in Soviet captivity was different in protocol, but equally implacable in result. In the generals' camp at Voikovo, The 186 High German officers interned peeled potatoes, tended the garden, and fed rabbits. They were exempt from heavy labor, but no administrative privilege shortened their sentence. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, captured at Stalingrad, was kept under house arrest in Moscow and used as a prosecution witness in Nuremberg. He was only released in November 1954 after 11 years of captivity. He was not allowed to join his family in the German West. He died of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis in Dresden in 1957. Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist, famous among his own soldiers for his relative humanism on the battlefield, was detained by the Americans, handed over to the Yugoslavs in 1946, tried by Yugoslavia and sentenced to 15 years, and then extradited to Russia, where he was accused with an irony bordering on the grotesque of having alienated the population of the Soviet Union through the use of kindness and goodness. He died in the Vladimir camp in October 1954. On the 11th of May 1950, Adenauer addressed the Bundestag and pronounced the phrase his collaborators had tried to soften: "I know no parallel in history for such coldness of heart." He was speaking of the men who remained in Soviet hands 5.5 years after the end of hostilities. There is an element that the debate on denazification usually leaves in the background: the cold. The winter of 1946-1947 was possibly the most brutal in Central Europe in several generations. In Cologne, there were 64 days between December and March, with temperatures below zero at 8 in the morning. Near Frankfurt, snow covered the ground until March. In Berlin, thermometers reached 18 degrees below zero in January 1947. Pipes burst. Berliners went to the Grunewald forests with meadow wheels and wheelbarrows to gather firewood. Electricity was cut for 8 or 10 hours a day. Some families burned their last furniture. In that context, the question of whether a second-tier party official deserved to be deprived of his job acquired a different dimension. The writer Karl Zuckmayer, who traveled that winter through Germany as a cultural envoy of the American government, described people in the basements of semi-destroyed buildings with the only heat source being a cannon stove, capable of heating one side of the room but not the other, with coats on all day, with fingers too numb to handle a pencil. In those conditions, the moral urgency to pursue former minor PGs evaporated before the physical urgency to survive. In Nuremberg, while the winter raged outside, the 7 condemned in Spandau also felt the cold. Albert Speer noted in his secret diaries that on Christmas Day 1946, with thermometers well below zero, Admiral Dönitz gave him a sausage, and Baldur von Schirach passed him a piece of bacon because neither had received provisions from home. The American priest gave them cigarettes and chocolate. Outside in the cities, music classes in the conservatories were suspended because there was no fuel to heat the classrooms. The inflation of the Reichsmark had destroyed any value of money. In Berlin, a packet of American washing powder cost 50 marks. $1 was worth 600 marks. The real economy functioned with American cigarettes as currency. On the Rhine, Elena Scriabina, a Russian who had worked forced labor in German factories during the war and remained in Koblenz under French occupation, noted in her memoirs that she went as far as seeing someone buy a truck in exchange for a suitcase full of cigarettes. It was the level of collapse in which decisions about the past were made. The black market that flourished in that context was the first laboratory of reconstruction for German social identity. In the makeshift stalls of Berlin's zoo station, unemployed former officers, displaced persons from the East, women exchanging inherited jewelry for potatoes, and also former party officials who had had the caution to bury enough in the garden to weather the winter, all mixed together. Survival dissolved the moral distinctions that the denazification process tried to maintain. In 1949, when the new government of the Federal Republic of Germany assumed control in Bonn, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer made a decision that would define the moral character of West German democracy for decades. Hans Globke, his state secretary, had been one of the main jurists who commented on and facilitated the Nuremberg laws of 1935, the laws that stripped Jews of their citizenship. He was a brilliant technocrat, He knew how the mechanisms of the state worked. Adenauer needed him. It was not the only case. Subsequent investigations would reveal that around 80% of the Nazi jurists who had served in the system of the Third Reich returned to work in the courts and ministries of the Federal Republic. 72 former judges and prosecutors of the People's Court, the infamous Volksgerichtshof where Roland Freisler had sentenced thousands of people to death, resumed their functions in the new Germany. Some remained active until the 70s. In the state of Baden-Württemberg, 96% of the judicial personnel who had served under the Nazi regime were retained by the new state. Adenauer himself justified it with an argument that his government would repeat in different variations for years. Germany needed to rebuild itself. To rebuild itself, it needed people with experience and training. To find people with experience and training in the Germany of 1945, one inevitably bumped into those who had acquired that experience and that training under Nazism. It was an argument that had a certain administrative logic and an unpayable moral debt to the dead. The Federal Supreme Court of West Germany did not convict a single Nazi judge or prosecutor, not one. The defense was always the same. They applied the law as it existed at that moment. Outside the judicial apparatus, continuity was similar in other spheres. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Federal Republic incorporated numerous diplomats who had served under Ribbentrop, including some who had signed documents facilitating deportations. The Information Department of the federal government in Bonn hired journalists who had worked in Goebbels' propaganda apparatus. Doctors who had participated in experiments on prisoners resumed their practices. Only a few were eventually pursued, generally decades later. The German pharmaceutical industry provided one of the most illustrative cases. The IG Farben conglomerate, which had produced the Zyklon B used in the gas chambers and had used slave labor in its facilities near Auschwitz, was dissolved by Allied order into 3 successor companies: BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst. Several of its directors had been convicted at Nuremberg. Most were released before their sentences were completed. By 1952, some had already resumed managerial positions in the successor companies. Not everyone waited for the courts to decide their fate. The popular mythology about the organization of ex-SS known as Odessa has been amplified and distorted by decades of spy novels and movies. But the core of the phenomenon was real. What existed with more certainty were the so-called ratlines, escape networks that connected Nazi fugitives with destinations in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, Bolivia, Spain, Italy, and the Near East. These networks functioned through a combination of ecclesiastical contacts, some bishops and priests, particularly in Italy, facilitated false identity documents, infiltrated humanitarian organizations, and complicity networks within Allied intelligence services, which already in 1946 and 1947 were beginning to see more value in certain experts of the regime than in the prosecution of their crimes. The Croatian bishop Alojzije Stepinac and the network of the so-called Rat Corridor through Italy and Spain allowed the passage of hundreds of war criminals. The Austrian priest Alois Hudal, rector of the Pontifical Teutonic Institute of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, documented himself having helped several ex-SS to obtain international Red Cross passports to emigrate. He did not do it in secret. He considered that it was his Christian duty. The most emblematic of the fugitives was Adolf Eichmann, the official who had directed the logistics of the Holocaust. He escaped to Argentina in 1950 under the name Ricardo Clement. He lived in Buenos Aires, worked in a plant of the Mercedes-Benz company, and raised his family in the working-class neighborhood of San Fernando. The Israeli Mossad captured him on the 11th of May 1960 and placed him on a commercial plane toward Israel, sedated and disguised as a crew member. He was tried in Jerusalem, convicted and executed on the 1st of June 1962. His trial was broadcast in part by radio to the whole world and marked a turning point in public consciousness regarding the Holocaust. Josef Mengele, the doctor of the Auschwitz ramp, also reached Argentina. Later, he fled to Paraguay and to Brazil, where he died by drowning on a beach in São Paulo in 1979. He was never captured. A team from the Simon Wiesenthal Center had been on the verge of locating him on multiple occasions. His remains were identified with certainty only after the exhumation of the grave in which he was buried under a false name. Franz Stangl, commandant of the Treblinka extermination camp, was detained in Brazil in 1967, thanks to an investigation by Simon Wiesenthal. Extradited to West Germany, he was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1970. He died of heart failure 6 months after the sentence. Klaus Barbie, head of the Gestapo in Lyon, responsible for the torture and deportation of hundreds of people, among them 44 Jewish children deported from the Isieux Children's Home in April 1944, lived in Bolivia for decades under the name Klaus Altmann and worked as an advisor for successive Bolivian governments. He was extradited to France in 1983, partly thanks to the work of investigative journalist Serge Klaasfeld. He died in prison in Lyon in 1991. What makes the ratlines phenomenon especially disturbing is that they did not operate only through the negligence of the Allies. In some cases, they counted on their active complicity. The American Military Intelligence Service, the CIC, protected several ex-SS in the post-war period in exchange for information on the Soviet Union. One of the most documented cases is that of SS General Karl Wolff, who had supervised the deportation of Italian Jews and was protected by the Americans for years, in part because of his role in the surrender negotiations in northern Italy in 1945. He was not convicted until 1964. In the spring of 1945, when American forces crossed into Bavaria, a group of scientists from the Peenemünde rocket complex surrendered voluntarily in the town of Reutte in Austria. Werner von Braun, the head of the V-2 rocket program, arrived in a wheelchair with an arm in a cast after a car accident. He was accompanied by more than 100 engineers and technicians. Von Braun was a member of the Nazi Party and had held the rank of Sturmbannführer in the SS. The V-2 rockets he had designed had been manufactured by thousands of prisoners in the underground camp of Mittelbau Dora, where working conditions murdered more people than the missile explosions themselves. It is estimated that between 12,000 and 20,000 workers died in the complex during the 2 years of production. The Americans recruited him anyway. Operation Paperclip, which President Truman authorized in 1946, brought to the United States more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians along with their families. The Nazi past of many of them was deliberately hidden or minimized in State Department reports to facilitate their legal entry into the country. Von Braun designed the Saturn V rocket that took humans to the moon in 1969. In the NASA archives, his name appears alongside those of the astronauts in the mission honor records of Apollo. The Mittelbau Dora camp does not appear in the commemorative brochures of the American space program. The Soviets did exactly the same thing, although with less elegance and more direct coercion. In October 1946, 2 days after elections in which the Socialist Unity Party had suffered a severe electoral defeat in Berlin, Soviet soldiers appeared in the early morning at the homes of thousands of engineers and technicians from the plants in the Soviet zone. The order was simple: you have 5 minutes to pack. 92 special trains transported them along with their families to facilities in the Soviet Union. Some returned in 1953. Others remained until 1958, the year in which the first Sputnik entered orbit. The German engineers were the intellectual fathers of both missile programs, the American and the Soviet. In the years following the war, Austria built one of the most solid structures of historical fiction of the 20th century. The Moscow Declaration of October 1943 had defined Austria as the first victim of Nazi aggression. It was a politically convenient formulation for the Allies, who needed to distinguish between the Germans, the enemy, and the Austrians, in whose recovery they had a strategic interest. But it was historically thick with lies. Adolf Hitler was Austrian. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the SD who replaced Heydrich, was Austrian. Adolf Eichmann was Austrian. Many of the commandants of the most efficient extermination camps were Austrian. Approximately 8% of the members of the Nazi Party were Austrian, while Austria represented less than 9% of the population of the Great Reich. The percentage of Austrians in the execution bodies of the Holocaust was disproportionately high in relation to their demographic weight. But the fiction of the victim was convenient for everyone. For the Allies, because it simplified post-war political management. For the Austrians, because it allowed them to manage the past without confronting it. Kurt Waldheim, Secretary-General of the United Nations between 1972 and 1981 and President of Austria between 1986 and 1992, had served as an intelligence officer for the German army in the Balkans during the war. Investigations carried out during his 1986 presidential campaign revealed that he had been present in the area when mass deportations and reprisals against civilians were executed under the command of his unit. There is no evidence that he directly ordered any crime, but his war memoirs had omitted those years with a precision that could only be deliberate. Waldheim himself admitted it. He had done what any officer did. The phrase was received in different countries with opposite reactions. In Austria, it helped him win the election. The American government put Waldheim on the list of persons prohibited from entering the territory of the United States. It was the first time that a sitting head of state received such a distinction. The Waldheim controversy forced Austria to initiate a process of historical reflection that had been pending for 40 years. In 1991, Chancellor Franz Vranitzky publicly recognized Austrian co-responsibility in the crimes of Nazism. It was the first time an Austrian leader made such an admission. The historian Ruth Beckerman filmed between 1986 and 1988 a documentary, Jenseits des Krieges, Beyond the War, in which she interviewed Austrian veterans at an exhibition on the crimes of the Wehrmacht in Vienna. Much of what they said was incredible, not because of what they revealed, but because of the normality with which they said it. One man described shootings of civilians in Greece as if recounting the details of a hunting trip. Another explained that, in war, everything happens. No one seemed to experience guilt. The past had been archived so perfectly that it no longer existed as an emotional experience. The writer Karl Zuckmayer spent the winter of 1946-1947 traveling across Germany as a cultural envoy of the American government. What he found was a country that had developed an extraordinary capacity for active forgetting. In Munich, he found a young woman whom he asked if she had heard anything about Hitler and the Nazi leaders since the end of the war. She replied that she had not had time to ask, that those things no longer interested her, and the war had ended barely 16 months before. The philosopher Karl Jaspers, who had survived the regime hiding his Jewish wife in Heidelberg, attempted a taxonomy of guilt in his essay The Question of German Guilt, published in 1946. He distinguished between criminal guilt of those who had committed direct crimes, political guilt of those who had inhabited and sustained that state, moral guilt of those who had looked the other way, kept silent, nodded their heads, and what he called metaphysical guilt, the universal responsibility that human beings share when they let crimes occur that they could have resisted. It was a rigorous philosophical construction. The problem is that its minor categories, moral and metaphysical guilt, were precisely the ones affecting the majority of ordinary Germans, whom the denazification process could not and did not intend to judge. The American reporter Saul K. Padover, who worked as a psychological intelligence officer for the American Army during the advance into Germany, noted in his memoirs an observation that became famous: "What worries me is where to find a Nazi. Obviously, there are no Nazis among the Nazis." In every city he visited during the advance of 1945, he interviewed German civilians. Everyone had voted against Hitler in their time. Everyone had resisted in private. No one seemed to have supported anything. The superhuman statistic that resulted from these statements was mathematically impossible and psychologically understandable. The writer and journalist Margaret Bovary, who lived through the whole period in Berlin and recorded it in her diaries, analyzed the phenomenon with more equanimity than Padover. It was not necessarily hypocrisy. It was the result of the regime having designed its participation structures precisely to make complicity indistinguishable from daily life. Paying taxes was sustaining the state. Sending children to the Hitler Youth was at once mandatory and apparently innocuous. Buying in a shop that had belonged to a Jew was benefiting from expropriation. The regime had built collective guilt as its greatest guarantee of survival. In the Soviet zone, denazification followed a different path. It was not more honest. It was more radical in its purges, but equally selective in its silences. The Soviets wanted to build a socialist state on the ruins of the Third Reich, and for that they needed to eliminate not only the Nazis, but any social class that could represent an alternative of power. The Junker nobility east of the Elbe, the industrial bourgeoisie, the large agricultural landowners, the magistrates, the independent journalists. Large estates of more than 100 hectares were confiscated in the autumn of 1945. The stately mansions that formed the heart of Eastern German villages were demolished or converted into clinics and asylums. In Mecklenburg, considered the most feudal region of Germany, 30 noble families were destroyed en masse through chain suicides or executions. A study of a sample of fewer than 9,000 Junker landowners showed that of the just over 2,000 survivors in May 1945, another 500 died in detention and 500 more took their own lives. The Spätzlager, the Soviet special camps installed in the former Nazi camps of Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, operated until the early 50s. The most reliable estimates indicate that of the more than 120,000 Germans who passed through them, nearly 43,000 died. The mass graves discovered decades later in Sachsenhausen contained approximately 12,500 bodies. Most had died of hunger or disease. Around 35 to 40 inmates died each day during the winter of 1946-1947. However, in terms of political purging of the judicial apparatus, the Soviet zone was more exhaustive than the Western one. In 1950, of the 1,000 judges in office in the German Democratic Republic, only one had been a member of the NSDAP. The contrast with the 80% of the Western judiciary was difficult to ignore. The price of that greater formal purity was the replacement of one system of injustice with another. The new judges of the GDR, trained in accelerated courses of Marxist jurisprudence, were no more impartial than their Nazi predecessors. They simply served a different ideology. The Soviet camps in East Germany did not disappear with the conclusion of the formal denazification process. They remained as a tool of political control until well into the 50s. Where does the figure of the 30 million Nazis come from? The 8.5 million members of the NSDAP are a documented starting point. The 25 million in the German Labour Front, the 17 million in the National People's Welfare Organization, the millions in the Hitler Youth, the National Socialist Women's League, the Reich Physicians League, the Teachers League. The most cited studies speak of up to 45 million Germans involved in one way or another in the structures of the regime. Not all were Nazis in the ideological sense, but all had been instruments of a state that murdered 6 million Jews, 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, hundreds of thousands of Poles, gypsies, disabled people, homosexuals, and dissidents. The historian Mary Fulbrook pointed out that the great dilemma of the German post-war period was the difficulty of assigning individual responsibility in a system designed to distribute and dissolve it. The butcher who delivered meat to the camp, the railwayman who drove the train, the accountant who recorded the income from confiscated goods, the doctor who signed the death certificates, the guard who opened the door, each could point toward another. No one had to pull the trigger if there was a system complex enough to distribute the action and atomize the responsibility. The philosopher Hannah Arendt covered the Eichmann trial for the New Yorker magazine and published in 1963 her analysis in the book Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. The central thesis was disturbing. Adolf Eichmann was not a monster. He was a mediocre bureaucrat with ambitions for promotion who never seriously considered the moral consequences of what he did. He followed orders, he processed papers, he organized logistics. Horror did not require monsters. It required efficient officials who had learned not to look where they should not. The phrase that generated the most controversy was also the most precise: the banality of evil. That the greatest crime of modern history was committed not by a horde of demons, but by an ordinary bureaucracy. The psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted between 1961 and 1962, in the exact months in which the Eichmann trial was unfolding in Jerusalem, his famous experiments on obedience to authority at Yale University. The results showed that approximately 65% of participants, normal people without any personality disorder, were capable of administering potentially lethal electric shocks to a subject if an authority figure indicated they should do so. Milgram did not mention Eichmann in the original publication of his results. It was not necessary. On the 1st of December 1963, the Attorney General of Hesse, Fritz Bauer, opened the Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt am Main. 22 defendants. All of them had worked in the extermination camp. None of them had been previously convicted. All of them had lived for 16 years in the new Germany, with jobs, families, and known addresses. Fritz Bauer was a peculiar man in the German judicial landscape of the 60s. He was Jewish. He had emigrated after Hitler's rise, had spent years in Denmark and Sweden, and had returned to Germany in 1949, convinced that his duty was exactly that, to return and work from within. His colleagues in the prosecutor's office looked at him with a mixture of distant respect and discomfort. It was he who had facilitated information to the Israeli Mossad about Eichmann's whereabouts in Buenos Aires because he knew that German courts would not try him. And it was he who in 1963 managed to open the most important process that West German justice had faced since the Nuremberg Trials. The process lasted more than 20 months. The testimonies of the survivors were the center of the trial. Hundreds of witnesses testified about what they had seen, what had been done to them, the names of those who had done it. Auschwitz stopped being an abstract name in the headlines to become something with specific faces, voices, and gestures. The sentences, delivered in August 1965, caused outrage among the survivors and their families. 6 life sentences, 11 prison terms ranging between 3 and 14 years, 3 acquittals. For men who had participated in the administration of a camp that had murdered more than 1 million people, the penalties seemed incongruous with the magnitude of the crime. The German journalist and writer Peter Schneider, who was 22 years old when the process began, wrote decades later that that trial was the moment when his generation began to understand that history was not a foreign country. It was their parents' house. Between 1950 and 1960, the Federal Republic of Germany lived through what was called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Cities in ruins became modern industrial centers. Unemployment fell to minimum levels. Germans bought the first televisions, the first private cars. The architect of that miracle was Ludwig Erhard, the economist who had designed the monetary reform of 1948 that put the German mark into circulation and abolished the rationing system at once. Erhard was famous for his absolute confidence in the free market mechanism. When American advisors warned him in June 1948 that his measures were a terrible mistake, he replied, "Herr General, do not listen to them. My own advisors tell me the same." He was right. The next day, the shop windows were filled with goods that had been hidden for months. In that context of accelerated prosperity, the past became something that had to be managed, not confronted. Anti-Nazism became the official norm. Active Nazism was declared unacceptable. But the grey universe of those who had participated without enthusiasm, obeyed without questioning, kept silent without protesting, was largely absorbed by the new Germany without being asked for much accountability. Chancellor Adenauer expressed it with a frankness that his advisors tried to soften. "We cannot build a state with people who have not been touched in any way by the past. We do not have them." It was true, and it was also the acceptance of a moral limit that the new democratic republic learned to live with. The new Germany rediscovered Goethe, Schiller, Bach, Beethoven. It reinvented itself as a people of culture. In the classrooms, teachers taught that Nazism had been an aberration imported from the darkest impulses of human history, not the logical result of decades of German domestic policy. The expression, the 0-hour Die Stunde Null, became an official metaphor. History began again in May 1945. What came before was another country. Thus believed the Germans, and also for the most part the Allies who needed a stable partner in Western Europe against the Soviet threat. Among the cases that best illustrate the silent continuity, few are as chilling as that of Werner Haider. Haider was the main organizer of the Nazi euthanasia program, known as T4, which between 1939 and 1941 murdered more than 70,000 people with physical and mental disabilities in facilities designed specifically for that purpose. It was, in essence, the technical rehearsal for the Holocaust. The same mechanism of bureaucratic selection, the same use of gas as an execution method, the same officials who would later be transferred to the eastern camps. After the war, Haider hid in Schleswig-Holstein under the name Fritz Saward and practiced as a doctor, not as a minor hospital employee, as a forensic expert for the courts and the state pension offices of the land. He signed medical certificates used in official legal cases. His fellow professionals and his employers knew who he was. No one spoke. He was identified and arrested only in 1959, 14 years after the end of the war. He committed suicide before his trial began in 1964. The Haider case was not an anomaly. It was the visible extreme of a widespread pattern. The doctor Hans Eisler, who had performed lethal experiments in Dachau and Buchenwald, fled to Egypt in 1958 when he was about to be detained and lived there the rest of his life under the protection of Nasser's government. The director of the children's euthanasia program, Hans Heinze, was briefly prosecuted but released and resumed his psychiatric career. The psychiatrist Karl Schneider, who had selected mental patients to be murdered, committed suicide in 1946, just before being tried. His colleagues who had participated in similar activities but of a lower profile continued practicing for decades. In the year 2011, a Munich court sentenced John Demjanjuk to 5 years in prison as an accomplice to the murder of 28,060 Jews at the Sobibor extermination camp. Demjanjuk was 91 years old. He had been born in Ukraine, had served as a guard in several Nazi extermination camps, and had emigrated to the United States after the war, where he worked as a mechanic in Cleveland and raised his family with apparent normality for decades. He was extradited to Germany in 2009. He died before the sentence was final. The legal novelty of the Demjanjuk case was crucial. German prosecutors argued, and the court accepted, that the mere fact of having served as a guard in an extermination camp made a person an accomplice to murder, regardless of whether it could be proved that they had directly killed anyone. It was a standard that, if it had been applied in 1945, would have implicated tens of thousands of people. In 2011, with most of those responsible already dead, it arrived 70 years late. In 2015, Oskar Groening, known as the accountant of Auschwitz because he had counted the money confiscated from prisoners arriving at the camp to send it to Berlin, was sentenced to 4 years in prison by the Nuremberg court. He was 93 years old. In the trial, Groening did something unusual. He admitted his moral responsibility without reservation. He said that what had happened in Auschwitz was a crime, that he had been part of that crime, that he had not had the courage to refuse to participate, that this did not exculpate him. It was the most honest statement that any former member of the Nazi apparatus made before a German court in 70 years of proceedings. He died before entering prison. In 2021, a German court convicted a 96-year-old woman, Irmgard Fürchner, who had worked as a secretary at the Stutthof concentration camp between 1943 and 1945. The defense argued that a secretary could not be considered an accomplice to the murder of more than 11,000 people. The court convicted. Those processes arrive when the involved are 90 years old and history is 70. They are late justice. They are also the demonstration that the system can only be judged when it can no longer defend itself. In the 60s and 70s, a new generation of Germans began to ask the questions their parents had avoided. The phenomenon had a political catalyst in the protests of '68, where German university students confronted their professors and their own parents with direct questions about what they had done between 1933 and 1945. Many middle-aged adults in the Germany of 1968 had grown up in the Third Reich, had served in the army, had been members of the Hitler Youth. The questions from their children put them in an awkward position that many simply refused to occupy. The writer Christa Wolf, who had grown up in Nazi Germany and later lived in East Germany, explored that territory in her novel Kindheitsmuster, Patterns of Childhood, published in 1976. The book narrates the process of a woman who tries to reconstruct what she thought and how she lived as a child under Nazism. The honesty of the book was destabilizing because it showed not a monster, but a normal girl who absorbed the ideology of her environment as any child absorbs the values of the world in which they are born. On the clinical level, the psychologists Alexander and Margarete Mitscherlich published in 1967 their analysis, The Inability to Mourn, which became one of the most influential books in the Federal Republic. Their thesis was that the Germans had not been able to process the mourning for Nazism because that would have required admitting the emotional attachment that many had had to Hitler and the regime. To avoid that painful admission, they had developed a kind of collective anesthesia that allowed them to function normally without processing the past. The second generation of Germans, those born between 1945 and 1960, built their identity largely on the rejection of that silence. Many became historians, journalists, artists, and politicians who made the confrontation with the Nazi past the axis of their work. Germany became paradoxically one of the countries that has most rigorously examined its own historical crimes. The Holocaust has today in Berlin a central memorial, the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, inaugurated in 2005, which occupies 19,000 square meters in the heart of the capital. In the sidewalks across the country there are embedded small brass plates, the Stolperstein or stumbling stones, with the names of victims of Nazism in front of the buildings where they lived. There are more than 100,000 of them distributed in 2,000 cities across Europe. There is a dimension to the history of the 30 million that trials, by definition, could not reach. The historian Christopher Browning published in 1992 his book Ordinary Men, about the Reserve Police Battalion 101 of the German Order Police. It was a unit of ordinary policemen, not ideological SS. The average age of its members in 1942 was 39 years. Many were married, fathers of families, workers and employees from the Hamburg of the 30s. They had not been specially trained to kill. In the summer of 1942, under the orders of Major Wilhelm Trapp, this battalion of men without any prior history of violence murdered approximately 38,000 Polish Jews and deported another 45,000 to the extermination camps. Major Trapp gave his men the option to withdraw before the first mass execution. Only a dozen did so. Browning's book is disturbing because it demonstrates that participation in the Holocaust did not require the ideological fanaticism of the party leaders, nor the especially perverse mentality of the SS guards. It required the ordinary disposition of ordinary men to obey orders in a context where disobedience had no serious consequences but was socially uncomfortable. In the Nuremberg process, in the secondary trials, in the Spruchkammern, in the German courts that operated until the 80s and 90s, all those ordinary men who had shot, dug, loaded, recorded, marked, processed and transported the victims were dispersed throughout society. They lived in houses in Hamburg, Frankfurt, Munich, Cologne. They sold shoes, taught mathematics, managed repair shops. Justice reached them in marginal numbers. Most died in their beds. In 1950, the Austrian government created the Reparations Fund for former political prisoners of the Nazi regime. Survivors could apply for compensation. The process was bureaucratically cumbersome and emotionally exhausting. Many survivors who had lost their entire family, their properties, their years, their health, had to fill out forms in 4 copies and wait for a response for months or years. In West Germany, reparations to Jewish victims were negotiated directly with the State of Israel through the Luxembourg Agreement of 1952. Israel received 3 billion German marks in goods and services. Individual survivors could apply for personal payments, which, depending on the type of persecution suffered, ranged between symbolic amounts and more substantial pensions. The Nazis who had been state officials received their old age pensions regularly. Heinrich Lübke, who was president of the Federal Republic of Germany between 1959 and 1969, had worked during the war on the construction of military facilities for which slave labor was used. The documents that proved his involvement were published by the East German press in 1966. The Western investigation concluded that his role had been that of architect, not that of camp administrator. He finished his term in office. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, sentenced by a British court in 1949 to 18 years in prison, was released in 1952. He died in his bed in 1973, with enough time to write his military memoirs, which became reference texts in the military academies of several NATO countries. Sepp Dietrich, sentenced to 25 years by the Dachau court for his responsibility in the Malmedy massacre, was released in 1955. He died in 1966 with all the honors of a war veteran. Jochen Peiper, the officer directly responsible for Malmedy, served years in prison, was released, worked in the Ferrari company as a technical translator in Stuttgart, and then settled in a house in Traves in the French department of Haute-Saône. What he did not know was that his neighbors knew who he was. On the night of the 13th to the 14th of July 1976, the eve of the anniversary of the French Revolution, his house was set on fire. He died in the fire. There were no convictions. The question of what happened to the 30 million Nazis after the war has an answer that historiography has taken decades to articulate clearly. Most continued living. Some were executed. 12 at Nuremberg, plus hundreds in the trials of the various allies. Some were imprisoned for years and then released. Some fled and built new identities under other names and on other continents. Some were recruited by the American or Soviet intelligence services, who found more value in their technical or operational experience than in their criminal past. And the vast majority, the immense majority, who had never pulled a trigger or signed a deportation order, but who had inhabited that state, paid its taxes, read its newspapers, left their children in its schools and voted for its parties, that majority that numbered around 30 or 40 million, depending on how complicity is defined, simply continued. What distinguishes Germany from many other countries that have lived through episodes of terror and collective complicity is that it eventually chose to look, not perfectly, not without resistance, not without zones of darkness that persist to this day, but it did. The Frankfurt Trials in the 60s, the debate on the Nazi past of the Bundeswehr in the 70s, the Waldheim controversy, which forced Austria to abandon its victim myth, the proliferation of memorials, museums, educational programs, laws that criminalize Holocaust denial. The question that those 30 million leave open is not primarily a historical question. It is a question about the nature of ordinary evil, about how far a reasonable person, well-fed with children they love, can go when the state in which they live decides that certain human beings do not deserve the category of persons, and about what a society does when that state falls and the foundations of the everyday world turn out to have been built on bones. Those 30 million did not disappear. They became the parents and the grandparents of the new Europe. And what they did with that past, if they kept it quiet or if they told it, if they pretended or if they confronted, if they taught or if they silenced, defines a part of what Europe is still today. The writer Heinrich Böll, who had fought in the Wehrmacht and survived to become the literary conscience of the new Germany, once said that the past does not pass, that it only sinks below the surface, that the work of a generation is to bring it back into the light so that the next does not have to live on top of it without knowing what they are stepping on. The last sentences of the 21st century nonagenarians tried for crimes committed 70 years before are the confirmation that this work never ends entirely. And perhaps it is better that way.